I'm Ronald James. Welcome to Bigger Questions. For thousands of years, humans have looked up at the cosmos and wondered, why are we here? Now, the trend is to look in the other direction. But there's nothing new about that. We indeed live in interesting times. Here we sit, taking another look at some of the oldest teachings about our existence. We're living in a matrix. An illusion? Yeah, they've been saying that for a long time. Long enough for more brilliant minds to dismiss the entire concept. But now, we're starting to prove it scientifically. How cool is that? What is the true nature of reality? And what is the connection between consciousness and spirit? What kind of a world will we live in when there is a total fusion of science and religion? The Bigger Questions series addresses these most fundamental of questions with the help and guidance of some of the scientific community's most brilliant thinkers. From the realms of quantum physics, parapsychology, psychology, mathematics, astronomy, and spiritual studies, we're asking bigger questions.
The brain is like an archaeological dig. It is set up to resonate well with a very narrow band of energy. We all know that the light we see is just a narrow band of the whole band of light. What we smell is a narrow band. Animals have much broader bands than these things. The brain's lower part is called the reptilian brain. That's the brain that just says, this is my leaf, I'm going to defend it, get off of my leaf, I want my food, the tongue goes out. We all have that reptilian brain. Up higher is the neo-mammalian brain. That's the one that wants to fight and kick butt and be angry. The higher brain is the cortex. That little part of the brain is what resonates with that energy around. That's the part that gives us this little model that allows us to go through day to day. If we really want to get in touch with the world, we have to understand our spiritual quotient, not just our IQ, the cortex, our EQ, the lower brain, our emotions, but let our brain function as best it can in unity, that is to connect with the outside world and really resonate with it. And to do it, it has to do three things. It has to be quiet and get its mind off itself. It has to focus on the heart, because the heart literally thinks. Even have our patient put their hand on their heart so that the brain and heart can fall into sync and resonate better. And third, and perhaps most important of all, realize that it is not alone. We must let the brain stop that one function, which is, I'm going to protect me at all costs. My country, my race, my age, my gender, and realize that brain, you're not in charge. It is time you realize you need a heart.
There's probably a strong hunger among people to have science verify some of their faith. And there may even be a hunger on the part of traditional faiths to see it verified. So I think there probably is a pulling together of a reconciliation between science and religion. The problem is that we're probably not really talking about religion in the sense of traditional religious structure. We're talking about something like the underlying mystical experience, which is the core of most religions. And that part will probably start fitting more and more closely to what science says. A lot of scientists get very upset at the notion that there can never be a reconciliation between this kind of deep level of personal experience and what science points out. But I think, in a sense, that scientists who get most upset are ignorant of the underlying guts of what's happening in terms of even just one area, just quantum mechanics as one area, where there's something strange about the properties of quantum coherence, and there's something strange about the non-locality in space and time, which may not be exactly what mystics have spoken about, but it's sure a whole lot closer than it was in Newton's day. And if that trend continues, then the big mystery is going to end up being a psychological mystery, which is how is it that this deep level of physics can be expressed and experienced at all. And that's a mystery. It may take a long time to solve, because it's taking matter, and matter is somehow informing itself about itself and nature. And when and if we can solve that one is a good question.
I've looked into spirituality, which is life-affirming, life-changing, deep experiences that people have. But then the committees get a hold of them and make them doctrinally pure, and we have religion. So I've certainly looked at spirituality, and I see important similarities in spirituality from all sorts of traditions all around the world. There is a common core of mystical experience of spirituality in that sense, which tells us something about the nature of the mind. But once the religions work it over in the committees for several generations, the actual experiences tend to get lost. And that's a shame, really, because my psychological studies have convinced me we are spiritual creatures, and if we deny that, we're not healthy. But most organized religions, unfortunately, have tended to turn it all into a set of words that doesn't actually lead to the deep experiences which we need to affirm our life. Every spiritual experience behind a religion has to be gotten back to in its original form. That is, to put it another way, we need spirituality that works for people living in the 21st century. Stuff that worked for 8th century Hindus or 5th century Christians, that was nice for them, but it doesn't work for us. One of my main lines of work as a transpersonal psychologist, as a researcher, is to look at spiritual traditions from around the world and their practices and try to see what happens when people in our culture today practice them. How can they be tuned up to become more effective? How can the experiences that result from those be integrated into a modern lifestyle? Practices, for instance, that require a monastic style of life, that's great if you can live in a monastery. Most people can't. Can't we have effective spiritual practices for those people? I think we can research those things and indeed come up with a spirituality and a set of practices that's effective for modern people and putting them in touch with the spirit. And that's exciting to think that that could be done.
I think one of the most fascinating things about looking at some of the ancient religions, even the mystical traditions such as the Essenes or the Hermetic, the Egyptian traditions, and especially the mystical ones such as the Kabbalah as well, is that the words may be different, the semantics, but they're all pretty much saying the same thing in terms of the importance of compassion, for example. I mean, you hear that in the Hindu tradition, you hear it in the Native American tradition, in the Buddhist tradition, and definitely in the Christian tradition. Also the idea that there's an observer, and if you think about some of the new findings in science and the importance of recognizing that that which you think as a scientist and that which you hypothesize oftentimes is exactly what you find. And so the idea that even if you're working on an experiment, you become part of the experiment and you affect it because of your presence. And so I know that that's a similarity, the idea of the observer in religion and in science. The other aspect that becomes so very clear is all of the basic religions talk about change and cycles and how we're in a process of creation that is indeed creating as it goes along. And the echo of the change emphasis in science is definitely there. The other thing that I found fascinating when you start looking at religion and science is to look at some of the basic ideas in terms of cycles, for example. And you see some of the ancient signs in the ruins, and then you look very closely at the shapes for the amino acids, and you're looking at them and you're saying, holy smoke, these shapes for the amino acids, these circles, look very similar to the signs that you see in the ancient ruins. And so the question becomes, are we rediscovering knowledge that's always been there? And so in a sense, I think that religion can point, particularly Eastern mystical religions, can point to some of the things that we're talking about in science.
Do we view God as a, there's different concepts of God. Some people view God as a kind of a regal figure, like a king, a very powerful person, because apparently has emotions, because he could get angry and supposedly like rain down fire like on Sodom and Gomorrah, but yet he's supposed to be a loving God. Well, I see no evidence for the existence of God that I mean, if God were loving, you would expect a lot fewer human casualties. And I mean, again, what testable hypothesis is there for the existence of God, let alone dealing with quantum physics? So you're taking one concept that really is not proven or is very nebulous with another, with a scientific theory. And why not say, what's the relationship between God and, say, calculus, or God in impressionistic art? I mean, I don't see the relationship between the two.
Because we have been ravished by the accomplishments of science in the material world, and also noetically, conceptually, mind-boggling worldview, we have converted them into the high priests of knowing. Well, their worldview differs from the religious worldview, but because of their status, why then it's like the dialogue is taking place on their home court. And you know, the home court has an advantage because all the spectators are cheering for the home team. That's the way it is now. So it's not a level playing field. So the first thing is that we've got to have a level playing field, and that consists of each side listening carefully to what the other side is saying, and not just writing it off, and realizing, both sides realizing they have something to contribute to the issue and that deserves listening to, and also that they are limited. They have limitations built into their particular approaches, and work for a respected partnership between the two parties.
This millennial transformation that we're living through now, I believe within a few years will sweep away the archaic understandings and barbaric practices of a world founded upon the illusion of differences. What we're seeing emerging right now, for example, in the United States, is a grassroots awakening to the realization that we cannot keep doing for the next 1,000 years exactly what we've been doing for the last 1,000 years. Our policies, our institutions, our agriculture, our energy, our social security is unsustainable. We need to put our government on a sustainable basis. We need to take advantage of the most up-to-date and comprehensive, holistic scientific understanding of natural law. And this is very much a transformation in progress. We're already going to be looking at a very different world as the emerging leadership, the people of America, speak, and as these ideas are heard by our political leadership.
Well, I think the future can be very positive. We're going through a very narrow constriction, and we could go one way or the other. To me, as we're looking at Armageddon in the eyes in the form of environmental catastrophes that are happening now and will get worse before they get better, even if we curb our actions very quickly. So once we get through that, thread that needle, and I hope to see it within my lifetime, then I think once we've turned the corner, then we're going to be basically creating our own reality. We'll be able to create our realities. We'll be able to return to Eden. We're going to be able to truly enjoy the full benefits of life, living with nature. Once we've learned those lessons, I don't know how quickly that's going to happen. Maybe we're going to need a little help maybe a part of that's one of the reasons why there are these interventions through the UFO phenomenon. I mean, one of the things in John Mack's research that's coming very clear are the stern warnings on the part of the so-called visitors of our treatment of the Earth and how that's going to have to change, and we're running out of time. So once we get through that as a species, then we have an opportunity, I think, to transcend, to have it both ways, to be able to live on Eden here, which is what a lot of the spiritual myths are about anyway, live in Eden here in harmony with one another, and also be able to inhabit many other worlds and universes as well.
I think it's very difficult because of the rate of change in science and society and everything. The rate of change is so fast now, and has been accelerating over the past 30 or 40 years perhaps, that it's extremely difficult to make predictions about anything anymore. But with that caveat in mind, I think that if you pay attention to leading edge thinkers in most disciplines, especially physics, but also biology, and to some degree in psychic phenomena as well, that you find that there is something happening. There is a change of opinion among the leaders of the fields, which makes it even more so that it's really something happening. What the something happening is not very well clear, but it's almost as though there's a pregnancy which is developing and a birth is in process, or something is going to be born. I suspect that it will happen in 10 to 15 years. I was always a fan of Terence McKenna, and of course he had 2012 as a target date that he came up with. And there are lots of people who make predictions based on numerology and the Mayan calendar and everything else about 2010 to 2020, something like that, as being an important time. And I don't see any reason not to believe that. In fact, just purely on a scientific basis, if you look at things like population growth, sometime in the next couple of decades, the population growth goes to a singularity. It means it goes to infinity, which is impossible, of course, but nevertheless, the population models are very rapidly increasing, which either means that there's going to be some incredible catastrophe that is going to be required to prevent the singularity from happening, or something else has to intervene. Something must occur. So now that there's the possibility that AIDS is a tip of the iceberg of new kinds of viruses that might wipe us all out and prevent the population explosion. That may or may not be true, although I do know that 30 years ago, when the population changes were being tracked, they took into account war and disease, and it wasn't enough to stop it. So we don't know. From lots of different perspectives, we're moving towards something with faster and faster, where it cannot sustain itself, almost on any level you can think of. So I think yes, I think something is occurring. In fact, you could probably say that with almost complete certainty that in the next couple of decades we will see many things that surprise us all, whether they come out of science or come out of the weather or a comet or who knows what. There will be many surprises.
There are many paths up the mountain. No one has a monopoly on the right way. Many, many ways. The designer of the system allows all these possibilities, and as religions become more conscious, they will truly see that, and they will see that if they keep their eye on the goal, which is to climb the mountain and lead humankind towards that greater future, then they will dissolve their polarities and will indeed join happily with each other without fear of someone invading their turf and their power position, etc., etc., etc. I mean, these are parts of a lower mode of consciousness expression. I think we're moving towards a higher mode of consciousness expression, where we truly see each other as one. We see ourselves in another and the other in ourselves. And that's a nice stage to be approaching. we're standing at the doorway, I think, of a tremendous expansion of consciousness and transformation. Just as we, humankind, we had the old brainstem aspect and the development of the limbic system, and then abruptly the development of cerebral cortex through all kinds of things. I think another aspect of that has been developing in us. I suspect it's not at the physical level. I suspect it's in reciprocal space, at the coarsest level of the vacuum. But it is in fact a higher organism for experiencing and knowing in the universe as part of us. And so indeed, we probably will change beyond Homo sapien to the next stage of the butterfly, if you like, metamorphosed as we continue on this adventure, which started such a long time ago. That we return home to total coherence with the One, with our parents, our spiritual parents.
There's a new theory that Candace Pert has. She's a biologist, and she makes the statement that this whole concept of right brain and left brain is passé. That what we need to think about is that each cell has intelligence in it, and so that we now are being asked to think of a mind-brain interaction rather than a brain. The other aspect that I think that would be interesting to look at too is the whole process of how a thought gives direction to something that you're doing, and then the emotion that you have gives it the force, and then that indeed becomes a feeling when it goes to your heart and you have a volition or a desire to do that. And that last statement that I made is very much from the Essene traditions, the ancient mystery schools, and also from the Navajo, from the Native Americans.
To me, at least, others have their own opinion, but I think that science is a near perfect way of understanding and working with the world of nature, the physical universe. And religion should keep its hands off because they know what they're doing and they've got the instruments and so on. But it's the world, the physical universe is only a part of the total scheme of things. Now, there is a glitch at this point because scientists, as scientists, do not admit that. Individual scientists will admit it, but it's not a part of science's understanding of itself, that there's furniture in the world that their method cannot inventory. And I think that is the most important concrete thing that generally we should be agreed upon. Now those other things, spirits, God, angels, and so on, cannot be proven to be there and therefore should not be delivered as though this were fact, but the bulk of humanity has believed in the existence of these discarnates or spirits of whatever sort. And so I think our intellectual, consensual, conventional wisdom, as they say, should recognize that this is a real possibility and not close it down because science can't get its hands on such things.
How do we discover the spiritual wisdom that originally, I think, fueled all the great religions? I think all what we now see as religion, I think they all started off from very similar basic insights, discoveries, the same basic wisdom. And then what's happened over time is that wisdom's been passed on from one person to another. It's been shaped by the culture, bits are being forgotten, bits are being added in. And so what we have today are very, very different sets of teachings, and that common core is not so readily apparent. And it's become very dogmatized and more of a belief system than anything else. And when you get into belief systems, people get very defensive about their belief system. And this happens in science as well as religion, and in politics, almost any other area, every area of life. It's almost we get more attached to our belief systems than we do to our material possessions. They're one of our most important things. And people very unwilling to change their belief systems. So where people are already caught in a particular religious belief system, I don't think it's going to be easy for most of those people to really open up and to embrace a belief system which is conflicting. What I think it needs to happen is we need to discover that wisdom which is there beneath all of those different belief systems, and that will then bring more life and meaning into any existing belief system, whether it's, you know, Christian or Hindu or whatever, or non-denominational, whatever the system, it will actually make that more alive.
I would say every major religion in the world, if it looks to its own roots, will discover that it has in common with other religions and science. What is the deepest scientific message brought to us by 300 years of scientific investigation? It is that we are all one. There is a universal field of intelligence that underlies and pervades us all. Well, what is the message of every religion, really? The message is we are all one, or we are all brothers. Yeah, we may disagree on the fine print, but in the big type, we all agree. And of course, people, the human mind, the human intellect, can find differences if we choose to divide ourselves. But those are really superficial differences. The fundamental truth, according to science and the greatest religious and spiritual traditions, is unity, if you look beyond the surface.
I think that we should examine some religious concepts such as the existence of the soul or some vehicle, non-physical or paraphysical vehicle for consciousness. Now that can be a testable hypothesis.
I think as we gain greater and greater acceptance of the non-local world in which we live, the statements that the mystics have made for thousands of years, the ideas that separation is an illusion, these mystical sayings that were hard to understand before we had a good physical understanding of non-locality, what the mystics say at the time of Patanjali, who said, when you quiet your mind, you will look into the distance, you'll look into the future, you'll heal the sick, you'll diagnose illnesses. Those statements that seemed very metaphorical a dozen years ago are now falling in line with the day-to-day research that we find in the parapsychological laboratory and also in the physics laboratory looking at non-local phenomena.
Fundamentally, what parapsychology says, what the data say, is that there's some form of interconnection. Fundamentally, what modern physics says is that there's some form of interconnection. And of course, basic religion has also said that there is some form of interconnection. Now, the problem occurs when you start trying to imagine that these interconnections are the same thing. And we don't really know enough yet about the nature of the interconnections to know how they fit. But the fact that we're all pointing in the same direction of interconnection as opposed to isolation and as opposed to separation suggests that they're all kind of aiming towards the same one truth about the way things are. So in that sense, the parapsychological data is kind of, I kind of put it in between the physical sciences and maybe mysticism. Not religion in general, but mainly mystical experiences and physics. They're both suggesting this kind of transcendent capabilities of the way that the fabric of the universe is and the way that experience is. And if you took an experience of the transcendent nature of the universe and you cast it into experience that people report, that is the context of parapsychology. People report experiences that seem to transcend space and time.
It's ridiculous to deny empirical evidence. It's ridiculous to demand that extraordinary evidence require, or extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That's a double standard. Empirical scientific approaches using the scientific method will yield what they yield. And with proper replications, then a model of reality can be developed. And for any scientist to deny the anomalies that are so obvious is unscientific. In fact, it's a religion. And it's called scientism. And right now we're dealing with a very, very conservative core group of scientists that are trying to regulate reality. And it shows everywhere, at the universities, Scientific American, and so forth. They may touch on these other subjects, but it's more like peripheral. And so what's going to happen now is a reordering, I think, where the causation is going to be perceived differently. That rather than cause and effect operating on a level of little building blocks of matter in physical interaction with other building blocks of matter that compose atoms, that compose blah, 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 obeying certain immutable laws of nature, and, like Newton's laws and relativity and so forth. What we're looking at now is this web of interconnectedness which seems to be everywhere. And again, you know, it's a fly in the ointment in the eyes and ears of a mainstream scientist, but I don't want to give them any more power. They already have enough. They're like the cardinals of the Catholic Church during the time of the Renaissance. And we're going through a very similar kind of revolution. It's a consciousness revolution, a major one, which puts more responsibility than ever on our creation, what humans are creating, both good and not so good. We're very powerful creators, much more so than this inanimate, dead, clock-like universe would say.
You know, it all goes back to your set of assumptions in the way you set up the picture. And if your assumption is such that you disallow certain kinds of things that you ultimately realize are really essential, then you have to propose an alternate possibility that is not disrupted by the formalism of what you've expressed. And so, sure, you got to have that in there. You got to have free will. Free will has got to be there. If you say differently than he, as I'm saying, that okay, the spirit intends, imprints on mind, pattern transferred to reciprocal space. If it's in the high frequency domain of reciprocal space and there's good coupling with direct space, then it will appear very quickly in space-time. If it's in same pattern in the very low frequency domain, it'll take much longer to appear in space-time. But in the meantime, some other imprints could have occurred which also may be there and then intermix with this and overlap with this. So that the future, although you can have a certain probability of saying this pattern should be there may be other patterns interfacing and overlaying it, and it may be hard to pull out the one that you were focusing on. Because free will, there's no growth without free will. So I cannot conceive of a simulator, of a device for building, developing a species, a creative species, without there being free will, because there has to be choice.
If we get over these aspects which binds us. What binds consciousness? What binds consciousness is the tendency of the mechanism of the brain to always present its memory whenever a learned stimulus is presented to it. The learned stimulus is played, but the memory also plays. And it's that memory play that produces a modification of the probability calculus of quantum mechanics. These modified probabilities are favorable to past responses only. So the brain develops a habit of responding the way it responded before. And that is what reflects as a conditioned habit pattern. Once this conditioned habit pattern has developed, we identify more and more with this conditioned habit pattern. We meaning consciousness, the whole. So the whole is identifying with a particular subclass of itself in its behavior. And that is what produces the individuality. It's not a bad thing, because by necessity of structure, the individual body already is individual. The body has an individuality. So once this body's individuality gets into a mental individuality through the mechanism of the brain, then there is also a mind that is individual. And so there is a reference point now that can be given. There is an individuality and one can refer to itself. Otherwise, one would not have any reference point to carry on even a conversation, let alone relationship. So the universe becomes a little more subtle this way. Otherwise, the universe would not have all the subtleties that individual identities produce. But the identities are all identities of the whole. They are not separate from the whole. We are not separate things and then we are connected to the whole. It's not like that. The whole is expressing itself in these various identities. Everything is always the whole. Notice the similarity of the holographic paradigm in this way. That is the real meaning of the holographic paradigm. It's not a physical hologram. It's hologram in the sense that everything is really ultimately does have that whole. It's always the whole. It never is without the whole. It's not part of a hologram where the wholeness is very restricted, limited. You know, hologram, the part of a hologram is only partly a whole. It's not really a whole because you cannot recapture the picture in its all glory. You compromise. You don't get the resolution very well if you take a small part of a hologram. But here, really, even the smallest part has all the potential of the entire consciousness. Every individual, every ego can eventually access everything that there is to access. So it's a much greater glory than even a hologram's glory.
The holographic paradigm, I think, makes such sense in terms of looking toward the future as well as understanding now. Because if you think in terms of a cell being a part of our body, that each one of us is a part of a whole, and that indeed that comes into the whole connectedness. It also speaks to the fact that we're responsible for one another, that one of the ancient tenets from the Essene is that the reason we're put here on this earth is so that we can develop our talents and that we can literally change, our own way of interacting with one another. And I think that in that sense, what happens to one person affects another person. And so that interconnectedness is just fantastic to think about.
There exists an order of reality that we can't see, that's been denied by the physicists, but which, if brought into the models, can then explain a wide variety of anomalies and paradoxes. So this entity, this unseen reality, must exist. And we can begin to deduce what the properties of that unseen reality is just from the effects that are caused in the seen reality. Now, I know this is dualistic because actually that interaction is more of a unitive phenomenon, which then leads us to understand better how the mechanism of consciousness works. And consciousness, I would define then as that process of the interaction between these two domains. How do they interact with one another? What are the conditions which are required for this interaction to become robust? And we're beginning to find that out, like the experiments of Dean Radin, for example, where groups coming together for prayer, satsang, or humor, or the new millennium coming in, can create a great deal of coherence, relatively speaking and statistically speaking, to a random event generator versus some baseline of random events. So that alignment in consciousness, for example, can actually literally create measurable results. So that's an example of the kind of thing that can be done to understand what the mechanism of consciousness really is.
Science definitely would have to come to terms with the whole. So whenever we are talking about the whole, whether we call it by a very religious name, such as God, this is the point then that will need discussion. I think in science we'll continue to call it consciousness. Let religions call it God. and that way we make a distinction, because really God is personal, very personal, and when we make it a personal search for this totality, this wholeness, to be perfect in a very personal way, then God is a better term to use. But on the other hand, when we are trying to find objective aspects that will apply to everyone, which is the object of science, we start discovering commonalities, then it is best to talk about consciousness. So depending on which modus you are in, if it's a personal investigation, call it God. If it is an impersonal investigation, such as a scientific investigation applicable to many people at the same time, then a neutral word like consciousness would be better to use always.
One of the things that's become clear to scientists who work in the area of quantum physics and are concerned about having a spiritual aspect to their life is that it's possible, without giving up your discerning mind, to also be a spiritual person. For example, the experience of love, the experience of transcendence, does not require you to believe anything at all. As we look into psychic phenomena, we inflow the pictures of remote viewing, which are documented and have been pursued for decades. People have the ability to inflow this information. We also outflow our healing intention, and Larry Dawsey and many others have written widely about the ability for people through prayer or just the outflow of their healing wishes to affect the healing potential of a distant person. And what we find is that between the inflow of psychic information and the outflow of healing intention is a quiet mind that has the opportunity to reside in these spiritual spaces, which is to say, to experience the peace that passes understanding, which was Jesus' description of the peace that's available. And this is a science experiment, that it is possible to quiet your mind and have these experiences, and a person, having been able to quiet his mind, can then go back and write up a lab report and say, did my experience correspond to the teachings of the discipline I'm following? And you can verify that what you're experiencing with regard to residing in love, having these oceanic experiences, does indeed correspond to the early Hindu, mystic, Christian, Buddhist teachings. You don't have to believe anything that would offend the discerning mind of the scientist. So there need be no quarrel at all between science and spirituality. Spirituality is an experience that's available, an experience of something beyond our ordinary selves.
I do not think that science, as science, can deal with God. It can offer wonderful analogies, but because science is restricted to mathematical understanding of the way of nature, and because science cannot deal with qualities, and God is nothing if not just saturated with awareness, feeling, love, compassion, I think it is off the charts for science if one adheres to a strict view of science. Of course, you can define words any way you want, and you can define science in such a way that it might include God, but I don't think it ever gets to it. I'll give a couple of examples. Stephen Hawking, even in his brief history of life, of time, he talks about God all the time, but all it is the ultimate equation, and God is not an equation.
As long as science has been in its infancy, focused upon the superficial levels of nature only, where nature appears so diverse, so separated, and so much in conflict, then modern science has not really been able to appreciate the greatest truths that come to us from our religious traditions. But in this century, particularly since Einstein, there has been an explosion of scientific knowledge of the deeper and deeper levels of nature, where nature is profoundly unified, where the unity of existence becomes the manifest truth. So science in its maturity, the science of unity, particularly unified quantum field theories of physics, has come actually already to recognize nature's deepest truths and the deepest truths of religion, the ultimate unity of everyone and everything. So we're at the beginning of a convergence. And once modern science has fully fleshed out the societal and the behavioral implications of the ultimate unity of life, it will look more and more like religion. Not in its practice, because science will always be about the empirical investigation of truth and the falsification or verification of experiment, but in terms of what it actually says about life, how to live our lives practically and in harmony with natural law, I think we'll see some of the age-old precepts of religion, like thou shalt not kill, etc., becoming more and more embraced by science, and we'll have a much better society.
Before anything else, we're humans, and we're all riding this river of life together. We're all family members, we're all one, you know, at different levels of expression. At this level of direct space, our sensory systems are based upon difference, so we see differences. I mean, it's not surprising. In reciprocal space, it's the mirror image of that, so there's a unity aspect. And so in that domain, of which we do not presently have cognitive awareness, but we can develop cognitive awareness of that, we will see this aspect of ourselves as one. No separations between us. It's a very interesting structure, the way this simulator works. So it's a question of having some measure of trust in the universe to guide our unfoldment and to be patient with ourselves as we go forward. You know, we've learned the language, we have a language of apples, and we want to describe oranges in the future. And as we go into this new territory of experience, we need a language which is like fuzzy logic. It can't be too precise, because it's got to bridge from what we have known to what we will know, and eventually we'll have a consensus and we'll be able to define it precisely. But it will be some time, and it will be collective. So patience, compassion, these qualities are really necessary for us to move individually and collectively to the next phase of the adventure, because it is a great adventure. Yeah.